When does love become obsession? And when does pulling away become cruelty? And the question that sat at the center of every courtroom argument, every therapy session.
She did everything right. She went to therapy every Tuesday for 6 years. She read every book Brené Brown ever wrote. She journaled. She meditated. She cut off the people who hurt her. She rebuilt herself from the ground up, brick by brick, scar by scar. And when she finally looked in the mirror and felt something close to whole, that's when she met him. That's when she met Marcus. And for a while, for a while, it felt like the reward. Like all that pain had finally been worth something. Like the universe had looked at everything she'd survived and said, "Okay, you've earned this one." But here's the thing about trauma that nobody puts in the self-help books. It doesn't leave when you tell it to. It doesn't disappear just because you've done the work. It goes quiet. It learns your language. It watches you fall in love. And then, like slowly, quietly, in ways you won't even notice until it's far too late, it starts making decisions for you. This is the story of Rebecca Calloway and Marcus Webb, two people who loved each other deeply, genuinely, and completely, and how that love, wrapped around two unhealed wounds, became one of the most devastating things either of them had ever survived.
By the time the police were involved, I had lost 17 pounds, my job, and 3 of my closest friends. Marcus had a restraining order, a new girlfriend, and a look in his eyes that people who knew him before said they didn't recognize.
The neighbors in their quiet Columbus, Ohio suburb would later tell reporters they never saw it coming, that they seemed like such a normal couple, that they seemed happy. But happiness and healing are two very different things. And this story asks questions that are going to make you uncomfortable because they don't have clean answers. Why do people who have survived the most painful childhoods so often find themselves in the most painful adult relationships? When does love become obsession? And when does pulling away become cruelty? And the question that sat at the center of every courtroom argument, every therapy session, every tearful phone call between Rebecca and her sister: who was really responsible for what happened? Was it Rebecca, who crossed lines that cannot be uncrossed? Was it Marcus, who kept coming back every single time she did? Or was it something older than both of them, something planted in their childhoods long before they ever met, that was always going to lead them here? Stay with me, because the answer is not the one you're expecting. Rebecca Ann Calloway was born in 1978 in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 3 children. By every outward measure, she had a normal childhood: a house with a yard, a mother who packed her lunches, a father who coached her Little League team on Saturday mornings. But inside that house, behind that perfectly ordinary front door, Rebecca's father was a man who operated on a frequency that nobody else in the family could predict. Some nights he came home warm and funny, the kind of dad who'd let you stay up past your bedtime and make pancakes at midnight. Other nights, and nobody ever knew which version was walking through that door, he came home cold, distant, critical in a way that cut right through you. He never hit anyone. He never had to. His silence was loud enough. His disappointment was physical. Rebecca learned early that love in her house was conditional, that it could be withdrawn without warning, that the safest thing she could do was make herself indispensable, be helpful enough, quiet enough, good enough, so that the warmth would stay. She carried that lesson into every relationship she ever had. Her college roommate, Dana, who remained one of her closest friends for over 20 years, described Rebecca this way in a 2019 interview with a local Ohio publication. "Becca was the most giving person I have ever known. She would do anything for the people she loved. Anything. And I used to think that was just who she was. It took me a long time to understand that she was terrified of what would happen if she stopped." Rebecca graduated from Ohio State in 2000 with a degree in social work, a choice that, looking back, makes a painful kind of sense.
I spent my 20s helping others with their trauma while carrying my own. I married at 29, divorced at 34. I found a thing I had to figure out was and built a career.
Spent the years that followed doing what she described to friends as finally figuring out who I actually am. She found a therapist she trusted. She did EMDR therapy for the childhood wounds she'd spent decades minimizing. She built a career she was proud of as a family services coordinator for a nonprofit in Columbus. She bought her own house. She planted a garden. She was, by every account, a woman who had done the hard, unglamorous, necessary work of healing. And then, in the fall of 2017, at a mutual friend's dinner party in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus, she sat down across from Marcus Webb. Marcus Jerome Webb was born in 1975 in Cincinnati, Ohio, the only child of Sandra and Robert Webb. His parents divorced when he was 7. His mother, Sandra, was a warm and devoted woman who worked double shifts as a nurse to keep them afloat. His father, Robert, was largely absent, not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in the quiet, grinding way that leaves a different kind of mark. Robert Webb would promise to show up, and then not show up. He would call for 3 weeks straight, and then disappear for 2 months. He was the kind of father who made his son feel, over and over again, that he was not quite worth the effort of staying. Marcus grew up learning to manage that pain by becoming the person everyone else needed. He was the friend who showed up when you called at 2 a.m., the coworker who stayed late to help you finish your project, the boyfriend who remembered every anniversary, every preference, every small detail that made you feel seen. People loved Marcus Webb. They loved him easily and immediately. And Marcus, though he would not have been able to articulate this until much later in his life, needed to be needed in the way that other people need oxygen. Because if you needed him, you couldn't leave him. If you depended on him, he had some control over the one thing his father had taught him was always just about to be taken away connection. Marcus had been married once before, briefly, in his early 30s. His ex-wife, a woman named Cheryl. She would later describe the relationship to a mutual friend in terms that are worth paying attention to. Marcus was the most attentive man I have ever dated. In the beginning, it felt incredible. But over time, I realized that his attentiveness wasn't really about me. It was about his own anxiety. He needed me to need him. And when I started becoming more independent, more confident, he didn't know what to do with that. He started pulling away, and then I'd chase him. And then he'd come back. It was exhausting. Marcus and Cheryl divorced after 3 years. He spent the years that followed throwing himself into his work as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm, his friendships, his gym routine. He told people he was fine. He mostly believed it. He had never been to therapy. See, he had never sat across from someone and said out loud, "My father leaving taught me that I am not enough to make someone stay." He had never connected the dots between that 7-year-old boy watching his father's car pull out of the driveway and the 42-year-old man who was about to walk into Rebecca Calloway's life and change it forever. The dinner party was at the home of a couple named Greg and Patrice, who had known both Rebecca and Marcus separately for years and had, with the well-meaning confidence of good friends everywhere, decided it was time they met. Rebecca almost didn't go. She'd had a long week at work and had texted Patrice twice that afternoon with increasingly creative excuses. Patrice, to her credit, wasn't having it. She showed up anyway. Marcus was already there when she arrived, standing in the kitchen with a glass of red wine, laughing at something Greg had said. Rebecca would later tell her therapist that she noticed him immediately, not because he was the most handsome man in the room, though he was certainly that, but because of the way he laughed. Open, unguarded, like a man who had nothing to prove. They ended up talking for 4 hours that night, about their work, their families, their divorces, their complicated relationships with their hometowns. They talked about books and about grief, and about what it felt like to rebuild your life in your 40s. By the time the other guests had gone home, they were still at the kitchen table, and Greg had fallen asleep on the couch, and Patrice was pretending to clean up just so she could keep listening. Marcus walked Rebecca to her car at midnight. Why, he didn't ask for her number. He said, "I really hope I see you again." And Rebecca drove home with her heart doing something it hadn't done in years. Something that felt, in that moment, entirely like hope. For the first 8 months, Rebecca and Marcus were, by every account, extraordinary together. He brought her coffee on Sunday mornings and remembered that she took it with oat milk and 1 sugar. She showed up to his work events and charmed every person in the room. They took a trip to Asheville, North Carolina in the spring of 2018 and came back with photographs that their friends said looked like a movie. Dana, Rebecca's college roommate, said she had never seen her friend so happy. "She was glowing," Dana said. Like, genuinely glowing. She kept saying, "This is what healthy feels like. This is what I was working toward." And I believed her. We all believed her. Marcus's friends said the same. His closest friend, a man named Darnell, who had known him since college, described Marcus during those early months as the most settled I'd ever seen him, like he'd finally stopped running from something. And maybe they were both right. Maybe, in those first 8 months, something genuinely healthy was being built. But underneath the coffee and the road trips and the photographs, 2 very specific, very old wounds were quietly finding each other. And the thing about wounds that find each other is that they don't always heal. Sometimes they just bleed together. It started, as it almost always does, with something small. In the summer of 2018, say Marcus was offered a major project at work that required him to travel to Pittsburgh every other week for 3 months. It was a significant opportunity. A promotion was attached to it, a raise, a chance to prove himself at a level he'd been working toward for years. He took it. Of course he took it, and Rebecca told him she was proud of him. She meant it. But the moment his car pulled out of her driveway for that first Pittsburgh trip, something shifted in Rebecca's nervous system. Something old and familiar, and completely irrational, and completely real. The little girl who had learned that love disappears without warning woke up, and she started watching. She started noticing how long it took him to reply to her texts. She started reading tone into messages that had no tone. She started asking questions that she knew, on some level, were not really about Pittsburgh. Marcus, for his part, did what people with avoidant attachment patterns do when they feel pressure closing in. He got quieter. He took a little longer to respond. Not because he didn't care, but because closeness, when it started to feel like a demand, triggered something in him that he had no language for. And the quieter he got, the louder Rebecca's anxiety became. And the louder her anxiety became, the quieter he got. They were caught in a cycle that psychologists call the anxious avoidant trap. And neither of them had the tools to name it, let alone break it. By the fall of 2018, the relationship had changed in ways that were visible to everyone around them. Rebecca had begun checking Marcus's social media multiple times a day. She had driven past his apartment on 2 occasions when he hadn't responded to her messages quickly enough. She had shown up at a bar where she knew he was having drinks with coworkers, not because she'd been invited, but because she needed to see for herself that everything was okay. Her therapist, Dr. Linda Marsh, who had been working with Rebecca for 6 years, would later describe this period in careful clinical terms. Rebecca was experiencing what we call a trauma activation. The attachment wound from her childhood, the fear of abandonment, the hypervigilance around love being withdrawn, had been triggered by the distance in the relationship. And instead of being able to regulate that fear, she was acting it out. She knew, on a cognitive level, that her behavior was not okay. But her nervous system was running a program that was 30 years old. Marcus, meanwhile, was doing something equally damaging in the opposite direction. He had begun confiding in his ex-wife, Cheryl, about the problems in the relationship. Not because he had romantic feelings for her, but because Cheryl was safe. Cheryl already knew him. Cheryl wouldn't leave. And when Rebecca found those messages, long, detailed, intimate conversations about her, about their relationship, about Marcus's doubts, it didn't just feel like a betrayal. It felt like confirmation of every fear she had ever had. It felt like her father's car pulling out of the driveway all over again. It was a Tuesday night in November of 2018 when everything came apart. Rebecca had found the messages with Cheryl that afternoon, while Marcus's phone was on the kitchen counter. She had not been snooping, or at least that's what she told herself. The phone had lit up with a notification, and she had seen Cheryl's name, and she had looked. What she read in those messages, Marcus describing her as exhausting, telling Cheryl he didn't know how much longer he could do this, asking Cheryl if she thought he was making a mistake, broke something in Rebecca that she would later describe as the last wall she had. She called Marcus. He didn't answer. She called again. He texted back, "I'm in a meeting. I'll call you tonight." She sat in her house for 4 hours. She did not eat. She did not call her therapist. She did not call Dana. She sat with those messages, and with 30 years of accumulated fear and grief and rage. And then she got in her car. She drove to Marcus's apartment on the north side of Columbus. She buzzed his unit from the lobby. He let her up. And what happened in that apartment over the next 2 hours would end up documented in a police report filed at 11:52 p.m. that Tuesday night, in a restraining order application filed the following Thursday, and in a therapist's case, notes that would later be referenced in a civil proceeding. Rebecca did not hurt Marcus physically, but she said things, screamed things, that his neighbors heard through the walls. She threw his phone across the room. She blocked the door when he tried to leave. She told him that if he walked out, she would make sure everyone in his life knew exactly who he really was. Reyes and Marcus, who had spent his entire life terrified of being abandoned, stood in his own apartment and felt, for the first time, genuinely afraid of the person standing in front of him. The police arrived at 11:52 p.m. Both Rebecca and Marcus were present. Neither had physical injuries. The responding officers documented the scene, took statements from both parties, and from a neighbor who had called 911 after hearing what she described as screaming and something breaking. Rebecca was not arrested that night, but the officer's report was detailed, and Marcus's attorney would later use it as the foundation for a restraining order that required Rebecca to stay at least 500 feet away from Marcus, his home, and his workplace. Rebecca drove home alone that night. She sat in her driveway for 40 minutes before she went inside. She called her therapist's emergency line at 1 a.m. Dr. Marsh called her back within 20 minutes. And in that phone call, Rebecca said something that Dr. Marsh would later describe as the beginning of a turning point. "I don't know who I was tonight. I don't know that person, and I'm terrified that I do." In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift and painful. Marcus told their mutual friends what had happened. Some of them, Greg and Patrice included, felt they had to choose sides, and they chose Marcus. Dana stayed with Rebecca, but she was honest with her in a way that was hard to hear. "Becca, I love you, but what you did was not okay, and you need more help than I can give you." Rebecca's sister, Carol, who lived in Indianapolis, drove to Columbus the weekend after the incident and spent 3 days with her. She later described those 3 days as some of the most frightening of her life, not because Rebecca was dangerous, but because she was so completely lost. The restraining order hearing was held in Franklin County Municipal Court in December of 2018. Rebecca did not contest it. Her attorney advised her not to, and she agreed, not because she was told to, but because she knew, by then, that Marcus had every right to feel safe. The judge granted the order. It was valid for 1 year. Rebecca sat in that courtroom and listened to Marcus's attorney read from the police report and from the neighbor's 911 call, and she felt something she would later describe to Dr. Marsh as the most clarifying shame I have ever experienced. Not the kind of shame that destroys you, the the kind that finally makes you see. What the courtroom did not hear, what no legal proceeding could capture, was the full picture of what had led to that Tuesday night. It did not hear about the Pittsburgh trips and the unanswered texts and the slow withdrawal that had activated every alarm in Rebecca's nervous system. It did not hear about Marcus's messages to Cheryl, or the pattern of coming back every time Rebecca reached out, or the way he had continued to engage with her even as the relationship deteriorated, not out of love, but out of his own inability to let go cleanly. The law is not equipped to adjudicate the psychology of attachment. It can only respond to behavior. And Rebecca's behavior, on that Tuesday night, had crossed a line that the law recognized clearly. What the law could not address was the question that Rebecca's therapist, her sister, and eventually Rebecca herself would spend the next 2 years sitting with, how do you hold someone accountable for behavior that was driven by a wound they didn't even know they had? Here is where the story takes a turn that nobody in that Columbus courtroom anticipated. 6 months after the restraining order was granted, in the summer of 2019, Rebecca entered a residential trauma treatment program in Tucson, Arizona. It was a 3-week intensive program specifically designed for adults with complex PTSD and attachment disorders. She had been referred by Dr. Marsh, who had been pushing her toward this level of care for months. Rebecca had resisted. She thought she'd already done the work. She thought therapy twice a week was enough. She thought she understood her patterns. She did not understand her patterns, not yet. In her second week at the program, during a group therapy session focused on childhood attachment, Rebecca had what her treatment team would later describe as a significant breakthrough. She was asked to describe her earliest memory of feeling loved, and she described a Saturday morning when she was 6 years old, when her father had taken her to get ice cream and held her hand in the parking lot and called her his best girl. And then she was asked, what happened next? And she remembered. He had come home that night in one of his cold moods. He had barely spoken to her at dinner. And 6-year-old Rebecca had spent the rest of that evening trying to figure out what she had done wrong, what she had done to make the warmth go away. In that group therapy room in Tucson, Seek's 41-year-old Rebecca Calloway finally understood something that changed everything. She had not loved Marcus Webb. Not really. She had loved the feeling of almost being loved by someone who felt familiar. She had been trying, for her entire adult life, to go back to that Saturday morning and make the warmth stay this time. Marcus had not been her partner. He had been her last attempt to rewrite a story that had been written before she was old enough to read. While Rebecca was in Tucson doing the hardest work of her life, Marcus Webb moved to Nashville, Tennessee. He took a job with a larger construction firm, found an apartment near the Gulch neighborhood, and by all outward appearances, started over. His friends said he seemed lighter, relieved, like a man who had narrowly escaped something. Darnell, his college friend, had visited him in Nashville in the fall of 2019 and later described the visit this way. Marcus seemed good, really good. He had a new city, a new job, new friends. He was dating someone. He seemed happy. The woman Marcus was dating was named Vanessa. She was 39, a marketing director, recently divorced, warm and funny, and, by the accounts of people who knew her, deeply kind. She was also, according to those same people, almost identical in emotional profile to Rebecca Calloway. The same warmth, the same giving nature, the same history of a difficult relationship with a parent, the same tendency to work very hard to keep the people she loved close. Marcus and Vanessa were engaged by the spring of 2020. Nobody who knew Marcus well sent Vanessa a warning. Nobody called her and said, "There is a pattern here that you should know about." And nobody told her that the man she was about to marry had never once sat across from a therapist and asked himself why he kept choosing women whose attachment wounds fit perfectly around his own. The cycle, in other words, was not broken. It had simply relocated to Nashville. In 2021, Rebecca Calloway gave a talk at a community mental health event in Columbus, Ohio. She was not a public figure. She was not a therapist or a researcher or an author. She was a 43-year-old woman who had done something she was deeply ashamed of, had faced the consequences of it, and had spent 2 years trying to understand how she had gotten there. She stood at a podium in a church fellowship hall in front of about 60 people, and she said something that the event organizer later posted on social media, where it was shared over 4,000 times. Second, she said, "I used to think I had a type. Turns out I had a wound. And until I understood the difference, I was going to keep choosing the same person in different bodies, and I was going to keep being surprised when it ended the same way." That quote traveled. It found its way into psychology blogs and relationship forums and Reddit threads and Facebook groups for adult survivors of childhood trauma. Because it named something that millions of people recognized but had never heard, said out loud so plainly. The research on this is not new. Psychologists have understood the connection between childhood attachment wounds and adult relationship patterns for decades. The work of Dr. John Bowlby on attachment theory, developed in the 1960s and expanded by researchers like Dr. Sue Johnson and Dr. Stan Tatkin, has shown consistently that the attachment patterns we develop in childhood, the strategies we use to stay close to our caregivers, become the templates for how we love as adults. If you grew up in a home where love was unpredictable, you will likely be drawn to relationships that feel unpredictable, not because you want to suffer, but because your nervous system has been calibrated to that frequency. It feels like home, even when it is destroying you. Rebecca Calloway is doing better now. She will tell you that herself, and she will also tell you that better is not the same as healed, and that healing is not a destination you arrive at. It is a practice you return to every day for the rest of your life. She is still in Columbus. She still works in family services, though she has moved into a role that focuses specifically on trauma-informed care for families in crisis. She has a garden that her neighbors have started asking her about. She has a dog named Biscuit, who, by all accounts, is completely spoiled. She is not in a relationship. She says she is not ready. She says she is learning, for the first time in her life, what it feels like to be alone without being lonely. And she says that is the most important thing she has ever learned. Marcus Webb married Vanessa in Nashville in June of 2020, in a small ceremony that was scaled back because of the pandemic. As of the last publicly available information, they are still married. Whether Marcus has ever done the work that Rebecca did, whether he has ever sat in a room and asked himself the hard questions about why he chooses the people he chooses and what he does when they get too close, is not something anyone outside his life can know. What we do know is that the patterns that drove him and Rebecca to that Tuesday night in November of 2018 do not disappear on their own. They travel with you, they move to Nashville, they show up at the next dinner party, they find the next person whose wound fits perfectly around yours. And they wait. Here is what this story is really about. It is not about a woman who lost control one night. It is not about a man who was too emotionally unavailable to love someone properly. It is about the invisible inheritance that so many of us carry, the emotional programming installed in us before we were old enough to question it, by people who were themselves carrying wounds they had never examined. Rebecca's father was not a monster. He was a man who had almost certainly grown up in a home where love was also conditional, also unpredictable, also something you had to earn. Marcus's father was not a villain. He was a man who had almost certainly learned, somewhere in his own history, that staying was harder than leaving. The wounds travel down through generations, like a river finding the path of least resistance. And they keep traveling until someone like Rebecca Calloway, standing at a podium in a church fellowship hall in Columbus, Ohio, decides to stop the current. The research tells us that trauma-bonded relationships are among the most difficult to leave, not because the love is not real, but because the attachment is not just to the person. It is to the feeling of almost being saved. It is to the hope that this time the warmth will stay. It is to the 6-year-old in the parking lot, holding her father's hand, not yet knowing what is coming. Breaking that bond requires more than willpower. It requires understanding. It requires the kind of honest, unflinching self-examination that most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. Because it is easier to blame the other person. It is easier to say he was wrong, she was crazy, they were toxic. It is much harder, and much more important, to ask, what in me chose this? What in me stayed? I want to ask you something before you go. Anastasis, and I want you to sit with it. Not just scroll past it, not just leave a quick comment, but actually sit with it. Have you ever been in a relationship, romantic or otherwise, where you look back now and you can see that you were not really choosing that person? That something older, something deeper, something you didn't even know was there was doing the choosing for you? Because if you have, and I think most of us have, if we're honest, then Rebecca's story is not just her story. It is the story of what happens when we love people before we have fully understood ourselves. And the question I want to leave you with today is this. If you could go back to the beginning of the relationship that hurt you the most, not to change what happened, but just to understand it, what do you think you would see that you couldn't see then? Now leave that in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about someone you know or something you've lived through, share it with them. Not because it has easy answers, but because sometimes the most important thing we can do for the people we love is hand them a mirror and say, you are not alone in this. If you are new here, this channel is dedicated to stories like Rebecca's. Real stories, human stories, stories about the things that happen in the spaces between the headlines, in the quiet rooms where people are trying to figure out how to love each other without destroying each other. Kindly subscribe to this channel, because next week we are here to give you relatable and enjoyable stories.